Hello, I'm Jim Egenrieder. I am on the research faculty of Virginia Tech here in the DC metro region in both engineering and education. And I'm also a professor in the master's programs in natural resources, which is actually international and online. But maybe most relevant to this group, I am a longtime science, agriculture, engineering, and other career and technical education courses, and a CTE and STEM specialist in regional schools, and work primarily in Arlington, Virginia, but also in Falls Church, Fairfax, and Alexandria City. So today, I want to talk to you just a very brief background, but then get into trends and issues in STEM education and how it may influence the way you think about your child's education programs. So I run a lab at the West Falls Church campus called the Think of It Lab, and it is primarily for creating hands-on learning experiences relevant to technical careers and college exploration, largely focused on the impact of the Internet of Things, or what everybody calls IoT, and how that may influence machine learning, otherwise known as artificial intelligence, etc. We have about 4,000 or so school-age students and their teachers come through our lab every year, and we're now in our fifth year. So I mentioned the Internet of Things, and we typically highlight a bunch of very tangible examples that young people and older people may be familiar with, but then talk about some of the more uh, fantastic, fantasy-oriented things. Of course, we talk a lot about robotics, just because robotics are increasingly prevalent in all that we do between the work world and our personal lives, and increasingly so in dimensions of our society that we don't typically think of them. This is the case of the Da Vinci robot in Arlington that could allow remote surgeries comfortably. We're really big on promoting invention and innovation and how just about anybody is capable of such things, but the big challenge is recognizing it. So in the grand scheme of what's possible, uh, this, by the way, has been proposed by Elon Musk, but I like to tell young people that anytime you're using a tool or a technology or thinking about something and you find yourself saying, this is great, but I wish blank, that whatever you fill in the blank with could be an opportunity for invention, something brand new, or innovation, where you're tweaking something or using it for a different purpose, all of which may be patentable. So some of these inventions can be fun and, as I mentioned, fantastic, um, but many of them, of course, result in real things that can change lives, including your own. So our program is really focused about 45 minutes or an hour on technical college and career exploration. Then we move them into our engineering lab. Our visitors are anywhere from third grade through 12th grade, and of course their teachers, and then many education programs, master's degree programs, doctoral programs bring their participants to us to get a feel for how experiences like this could be in their own schools. We also build labs in schools and conduct programs in schools and community centers. And then, of course, we support a broad range of graduate student coursework. In fact, I think I've got 7 students right now working on dissertations relevant to what we do. We do a lot of teacher professional development, Saturday and summer camps, and Sliding Doors has participated and created many of those with us, and then a wide variety of special audiences, including many international audiences who come to see how STEM education is conducted in the United States. I also host as many as 50 plus internships every year from all around the DC metro area. a big concern and driving force for me is finding future STEM workers, really, developing the future workforce rather than importing them from other countries or even other parts of the US. We're trying to find ways to grow our own technical workforce. And that's a challenge for us in the United States. That, of course, requires some resilience because I firmly believe that most young people think of themselves as artists and scientists and engineers until some adult tells them that they are not. And I want to build resilience among young people so that when they do pick up that message implicitly or explicitly from some adult, they can ignore them and keep doing what they're doing and striving for their own goals. We believe that this STEM resilience is enforced by highly engaging curricula, after school clubs and activities, and Saturday and summer enrichment. That was promoted by a 2013 National Academies report. To that, I add two things: early exposures, starting really in pre-K. I don't get them involved in algorithms and coding until closer to third grade. Actually, you can teach algorithms to kindergartens pretty comfortably. But then on the back end, make sure we're explicit about accessible and varied pathways that would get them from their middle school experiences, academic experiences, to careers, and help them begin to envision their future. Now, as we talk about STEM, I want to highlight a few key things. In fact, if this were a teacher professional development program or a graduate course, by the way, you're kind of experiencing a full semester graduate course in 30 to 45 minutes here. I would get everybody to define these terms on their own. Then I would walk them through my own definitions. I might touch on arts integrated STEM or STEAM. Agriculture uses an A in STEAM also, and there are others who do so. Some inject reading into STEAM and STEM, and I think that's really important, especially for English language learners or twice exceptional students. But when it comes to science, most of us think of science the way we learned it in middle school, and I think that's a little disappointing. I want them to think of it as a process for answering questions in the body of knowledge that's derived from that process. Or better, I want them to think of it as a process for answering questions based on observation or experimentation. And then, as they get into high school and college, of course, I want them to think of it as how to identify the influence of one variable on a particular outcome: independent variable, dependent variable. When it comes to technology, I think most people think of our digital technologies of today and computers, but I want you to know that technology could be anything that is a modification of the natural world. Some do include for human purposes. And I think that's an anthropocentric perspective that's unnecessary. There's lots of evidence of other animals creating and using tools. But as long as you capture that main point, that it's any purposeful modification of the natural world, I think it's consistent with the way thought leaders are pursuing this. Engineering is thought of as an applied science, and there are many jokes about what is engineering. But I'd like you to think of engineering as developing solutions to challenges or problems using design. And design is really the key word. So it's not just doing crazy experiments and trying things and trying things. It does require some pre-thought. And we use engineering design processes for that. In elementary, we use a 5-step engineering design process, mostly by the Museum of Science in Boston, called Engineering is Elementary. Then later, we get them thinking along the lines of what you see on my screen here, which is identify a problem, criteria, and constraints, start brainstorming solutions, maybe pick one idea and maybe do additional background research, but then build a model. Then you can test the model or go straight toward building a prototype and test that prototype. And based on those outcomes, refine the design. Now, the International Technology and Engineering Education Association in May, and then formally in July, published a new approach to engineering design processes that has 16 steps. And I think that's very useful in academic settings. But practically speaking, this is the kind of approach I'd encourage you to take if you were designing maybe a new recipe, or your son or daughter is redesigning their bedroom, or maybe redesigning the landscape in your backyard. You can take these kinds of design processes and use them for just about any purpose that presents a challenge or problem for you. Math is probably the hardest thing for the average person to design, but this is what I promote: the study of relationships between things, whether they are real or imaginary, based on logic. I then typically intentionally pause and say, and sometimes quantified with numbers. Necessarily in elementary schools, we talk a lot about numeracy, but it really is about logic. And Venn diagrams are a great example of that. You can actually quantify a Venn diagram with area calculations, but it's really about logic. And many of you who took Philosophy 101, Introduction to Logic, probably started with a lot of Venn diagrams. Of course, math leads you to this, which eludes many people, and but having that foundation and thinking logically, I think, gets you to all of these other places. And if we have a longer opportunity sometime, I'm happy to present algebra and geometry and calculus in that idea of the study of relationships. And just as an example, the study of algebra is the relationships between things that are known and unknown. Geometry, shapes and their parts; trigonometry, triangles and their parts and what they represent. And then calculus could even be, summarized as the relationships between a straight line and a curved line, and the relationships between two curved lines and what those lines represent, whether it's statistics or calculating area, etc. But there are many other ways to teach math, and I think disappointingly, so much of our math instruction is currently as though we were teaching future math teachers and not math users and math lovers. Uh, so I'm really interested in this, by the way, and I think there's initiatives in your organization to pursue better math instruction, and I hope I can be part of that with you. Now, I want to get into how I develop curriculum, because I know many of you are doing exactly this, whether formally, informally, or simply at home when you're creating family experiences that have broader outcomes. I start with the desired outcome. Now, this could be goals that are established by you, maybe even by your kid, or they can be bigger and broader goals. I'll get into that in a moment. Then I determine my assessment plan. How will I ensure that my constituents, whether they're adults or kids, achieved my desired outcomes? It's then that I plan my learning experiences. One other component of my curriculum development is making time for, after the initial pilot or experiment, for reflection and documentation, so that I learn from each and every time I develop a new curriculum experience or refine it. My goals in the really broad picture are self-actualization. Of course, self-actualization is built on self-awareness, and uh, that's a big part of what I do in my lab every day. I also want to promote flexibility and adaptability, and the skills and strategies for innovation, self-reliance, and of course those things get you to self-actualization. But in the real world, I think it's critical that whatever curriculum you develop, that you consider things that are official. It may not be necessary for you to get official approval for your curricula, but if you ever want to share it or get other people to consider it, or even get, certainly if you ever want anyone to ever pay for it, it really is important, if not necessary, to consider things like standards of learning in Virginia. Elsewhere, it could be Common Core or Next Generation Science Standards. Also in Virginia, Verso, which lists all the technical competencies for technical coursework, otherwise known as career and technical education, that becomes available to kids in 6th grade. And then if you work with a local school division, or if young people in your program eventually plan to go to public schools, you would want them to know the objectives of the school system and maybe even a specific school. When it comes to assessment, I want to point out 3 types of assessment. Most of you are familiar with formative and summative assessment, but I also want to share with you an important one called diagnostic assessment, where you're actually measuring readiness. And in diagnostic assessment, you want to know whether your students are ready for what you've prepared. So that may be a combination of subject area knowledge, what they can do, what they're capable of learning, and then um, also opportunities for you to clarify misconceptions that they may reveal, and then give you a chance to refine your planned activities. So these things could include, some of the more boring things like pretests. I think self-assessment is great, by the way, especially if you can create a comfortable way for them to talk about it and discuss it. But then you can do things like give them anonymous opportunities to uh, just share openly in an online environment through discussion boards and things like that. I also really like interviews where you can have just these short 5 to 10 minute discussions with each student. Hey, how do you feel about this upcoming year? Based on what you saw me outline today, is any of this intimidating to you? Is all of it exciting? Is some of it maybe, I don't know, unfortunately boring to you? And it gives you a chance to learn from that young person, their orientation and attitude toward what you'll be doing. Formative assessment that you might already be familiar with is that chance for us to check on student progress, not just occasionally and maybe more explicit than simply saying regularly, but I'd argue for every day. So it's a measure of your students' progress, your progress as an instructor, and then your students' success that influences your success and the readiness for whatever is planned next. So this can be pretty easy, and it can be really low effort just by making thoughtful observations during class activities, then reflecting on it afterwards. You can look for nonverbal feedback as you're talking, see who's nodding their head, who's smiling at your attempts to be humorous or clever, and really picking up on things. Homework exercises can actually be really useful for formative assessment, but you don't want it to be so overwhelming that it actually um, maybe uh, erodes some of their enthusiasm for your course. If your students keep journals, and online STEM journals are really terrific ways of doing that. I think Google Docs are wonderfully situated for online STEM journals. It gives you as an instructor or parent an opportunity to just jump in, ask questions, make comments, and seeing what they're doing. Um, it gives you a chance as an instructor to have informal surveys and share your findings and let students reflect on how their attitude compares to what was presented in the survey. You can have Q&A sessions. They can be formal, informal, spontaneous. They can be one-on-one, like I mentioned. You can have in-class student informal presentations. I think presentations are a big, big thing. I began with very short 20-second presentations, seated, no big deal. Hey, tell us your name, what school you go to, what your favorite subjects are, what are your skills, strengths, what are your interests, what's influencing your decision making, those kinds of things on a regular basis. What'd you think about the reading last night? Hey, did you get a chance to read last night? That gives them a chance to say, no, I didn't, I meant to, and I just forgot, or I had a lot of other homework. Then I say, no sweat. Let me know if you need me to review anything for you. And then I actually solicit feedback about my instruction and then get them to give feedback on their own progress. And you can do that as sort of what I call an exit ticket as they leave the room. But there are many ways to do that. Summative assessment that you're all certainly familiar with, the big scary things like high stakes exams. A final exam, which is a genuine summative assessment. This is what have you mastered during this semester, this quarter, this unit, or maybe even you might have an exam for a particular long lesson. Papers, I think, are great. Drafts are typically considered formative, but I really want to emphasize some of what I'm going to share next. I think projects are probably my favorite. Uh, there are many opportunities for formative assessment along the way, many opportunities for presentations along the way, asking how each person is making progress. I do this every week in an online meeting with my interns, high school interns. It gets them used to hearing what others do. My younger students get to hear my high school juniors and seniors who are in AP and IB classes talking about their progress, and boy, do they work hard to mimic them. It's really great to watch. Portfolios, I think, are great, and it honors students who may have different ideas for how to demonstrate their mastery. Student evaluations of the courses reveal a lot more than you imagine they will until you see one. And it, it sometimes stings a little and sometimes surprises you. Um, and then I think it's important as an instructor to do your own self-evaluation, maybe even record it. If you really want to give yourself grief, record it on video and watch it a year later. But all very useful kinds of assessment. You could even share that video or written evaluation with your students and include in that discussion some of the findings and what they shared. Then I begin my learning activities planning. I always focus on inquiry-driven investigations. I think it is the strategy I adopted first in 1999 and have promoted ever since. And it's been great for me. I've won national awards and state awards, state science teacher award, that kind of thing, all because of my emphasis on inquiry. And I'm happy to talk about this and help with anybody planning curricula. A big focus for me is also STEM habits of mind. It's why I want everybody to have STEM experiences and have integrated STEM activities, regardless of the curricula they're studying. And if I were to summarize them, it would be among this list, and this is just a subset of possibilities. But you see the big C's there: creativity, critical thinking, etc. But you also see things like making predictions and using data, getting up to the higher levels of the revised Bloom's taxonomy in analysis and evaluation, applying things to real world problems or challenges, collaboration, reflection, making mistakes comfortably, taking calculated risks, all those things. they're all consistent with p21.org. This is a great curriculum strategy that I encourage you to look up. You see down the lower right-hand corner, it's just p21.org. It shows how you integrate all these things that we try to do with the profile of a graduate in Virginia, portrait of a graduate if you're a Fairfax County student. I was involved in Fairfax County's program in its design. Uh, that includes life and career skills, learning and innovation skills, IT skills, and then of course the subject area skills, and then making sure it all reflects standards, assessment plans, curriculum and instruction plans, teacher professional development, and how you create your learning environments. So most of it is based on backwards design, which is similar to what I just shared with you, starting with desired outcomes, then assessment, then your learning experiences. I may have used learning activities earlier. There's a big push to refer to them as learning experiences rather than activities. I also really like how P21 emphasizes something important to me, which is the autonomy of the learner. I even build my graduate courses around online asynchronous project-based learning and promote that autonomy. And trust me, most 22-year-olds aren't ready for that. Most of my students, in fact, are typically 30 through 60. Then I I think of the instructor and the leader as the coach or mentor, as a facilitator, instead of that sage on a stage. And then I look for ways to integrate technology in all of the above in meaningful, thoughtful ways, not just for the sake of using technology. When it comes to teaching styles, I usually prefer the fourth and the fifth that are listed there rather than the first three in my own approach to this. By the way, I actually believe that all students should have exposure to all kinds of teachers, instructors, and professors. I'd want them to work and learn from an expert in a particular field, even if it's intimidating. And I'd want them to have those teachers who think of themselves as the authority figure, who have no flexibility, get them used to those kinds of things, because they will have bosses like that someday. And I like them to have models that they like too. But no matter how good I eventually become, I don't ever imagine that I'll be the right fit for all of my students. So I like them to have others too. I do like to think of myself as a facilitator and promoting independent thoughts and actions, completely respectful of the learner's needs, personal, professional, and academic goals. And then as a delegator, I I think particularly in my natural resources work, many of my students already have graduate degrees and certainly undergraduate degrees in this field. So I really want them to develop their voice. This is more difficult when you're working with even 10th graders and certainly below. But in an AP course, an IB course, I think it can be appropriate, at least for part of the curriculum. So I've hinted that a big focus for me is on project-based learning, and I'm going to get into the why, when, how often, and how I grade it here. I rely on project-based learning developed primarily from the Autodesk Foundation in the late 1990s and early 2000s that were so influential to me. Those folks became the Buck Institute for Education out in Marin County, and they're still the authority. They go by the name PBL Works now, and I still regularly refer to Larmer and Mergendahler's 8 Essentials of Project-Based Learning, and I actually went out there and studied with them in 2003 and 2004. But it involves significant content, a student's need to know, a driving question of their own, and the student having voice in choice in how the curricula are constructed. Then emphasizing 21st century skills, which I don't like to call 21st century now that we're in the third decade of the 21st century. But then inquiry and innovation, feedback opportunities, and revision opportunities. That's something that still seems new to most classrooms, the opportunity to redo something you didn't do so well on. But engineering design processes or just design processes are built around that. The idea that you probably won't be content with your first try. And then, as I mentioned over and over before, publicly presented products. However, I'm focused here on publicly. I make my graduate students publish things to the web, whether it's in a wiki or a blog, so that the whole world can find it. It's a shame to me that I would be the only audience for my students' hard work. But I even did that with 10th graders, and some of you may have even heard this story before, but um, I learned that when you publish young people's work online, it doesn't have to have their name on it. It doesn't have to have their full name on it. Although, if given the choice, many students, almost all of my graduate students, put their whole name on their pages they develop. I don't require that though, for obvious reasons. But I've had 10th graders' work show up on university professors' syllabi because they didn't realize they were 10th graders who wrote, in my favorite example, a website focused on arachnid taxonomy, spiders, mites, ticks, and scorpions. Project-based learning fits very nicely with scientific methods and engineering design processes, but all of this is not new. Um, you know, John Dewey, who almost all modern educators have studied, was extremely influential in this, as was his doctoral student, William Hurd Kilpatrick, who did most of his work right around 1906 through 1908, if I recall. But it starts way back even earlier, um, with Comenius in the 1600s. Actually, that name is pronounced in many different ways depending on what language you read about him. Um, Pestalozzi, or maybe a little bit later than that, but then Piaget and Montessori, who were sort of age peers of John Dewey, also were very influential in modern day project-based learning. I rely a lot in my teaching and my influences on young people. I rely on the work of Lev Vygotsky, who came up with that idea of the zone of proximal development. And probably the best way to define this is exactly what you see here: how a teacher makes the difference between what a learner can do on their own and what they could do with help. And that's really how I define myself. I go one step further, I guess. I want all my students to outgrow me, and that's true even when I was a scuba instructor and a whitewater kayak instructor. People would want to sign up for a fourth and a fifth lesson from me as a kayak student, and I'd be like, "How about you just come paddle with me? I don't want you paying me anymore." And I want them to think of me as a peer and develop on their own and start to practice on their own too. So I really like the idea of themes in my instruction to promote project-based learning. Um, when we use themes like computational thinking and technological literacy and energy and ecology and sustainability and global thinking, global citizenship, agriculture and food safety, and I think health and medical literacy, they're all really, really great themes to make your curricula relevant. And if, as a teacher, you can't imagine how to do this, boy, put on the brakes and go figure that out, because it is magic when it comes to students understanding why they're learning what they're learning. They'll remember the anecdotes that are relevant to their lives, sometimes forever. My goal sometimes is just to have a student at the dinner table later that night have a thoughtful answer when their parents say, "What did you do in biology today?" or "What did you do in your engineering class today?" or "How was your biodiversity?" or whatever other course I might be teaching at the time, and have that student, oh, it was great, we learned about this. But if I can deliver things that a student might remember forever because it was tied to something relevant in their lives, or maybe even a humorous anecdote that they are eager to retell someone else, I know I've succeeded. This is all consistent with what the next generation science standards refer to as cross-cutting concepts. So you can use themes like patterns, cause and effect, scale, proportion, quantity, systems. Systems thinking is a terrific way to teach just about anything. And that includes things like world languages and visual and performing arts. And anyway, the list goes on, and I'm pleased to talk about that individually. Then things like energy and matter, structure and function, stability and change. Creativity is a really big goal of mine. There are multiple ways to think of creativity, but for the student, I simply want them to begin thinking about their own thinking and how to improve their own outcomes. Teaching the lifelong learner. When I work with teachers, I want them to be thoughtful about their accomplishments and recording their findings and discoveries so that each time they do something, they do it better. I want all my students to begin thinking of themselves as polymaths, which is sort of the modern version of a Renaissance thinker. Sorry, I didn't mean to go that fast. And polymathy, I suppose, in one way means good at many things. But I don't want them to think of themselves as one singularly skilled person. And so much of what we do reinforces that. Kids who build their lives around gymnastics and figure skating and some other things, I would hope that they always have at least one other driving motivation in their life, but ideally many. I really encourage most kids to think of themselves as master generalists, and I firmly believe all teachers should think of themselves as master generalists, able to be good at anything they try. So I mentioned the notion of mistakes and calculated risk taking, but all of this fits in nicely to those STEM habits of mind I introduced earlier. I do want to focus on STEAM. I want you to know I've been critical of STEAM. Often I don't believe it's been rigorous enough to qualify as STEAM, and it's frankly just art. But I think if you really do STEAM well, it can engage much broader audiences and get young people who've maybe disassociated from science after a bad science fair experience, or disassociated from math after struggles in Algebra 1, or when their friends picked up algebra a little faster than they did. uh, I I can reconnect them often through STEAM. And this is actually a third grader in my lab who was with her friends there, were painting fish. It's a process called geotaku, where they imprint that fish onto either fancy paper, or in this case, um, lab coats or bags or other things, even just a t-shirt. And then we dissect the fish, and then I keep a couple fish in reserve, and I show them how to fillet it, or clean it, then fillet it, and then cook it. And they have this holistic experience. There's the social studies aspects of these ancient Japanese rituals and why that's so important to their culture. Then, of course, they get to do something arts and crafts oriented. I know artists frown on craft people, but I think craft people are much closer to industrial design than the artists would like to admit. And then of course they have the cooking experience, and there's a chance to introduce a lot of great chemistry and physics in cooking. But I also want you to know that art represents the use of processes and systems and recognizing patterns, and if you watch just about any artist for a while, you will see that they revert to these patterns and strategies and systems that work for them. Sometimes there's something that they learned from others, sometimes they've developed them on their own. But if a thoughtful artist begins examining the efficiency and efficacy of their processes, systems, and patterns, they really are beginning to think like an engineer and a scientist. And of course, there's a lot of logic behind that. I don't know why, but we can't get art teachers teaching technical drawing in their classrooms. And the distinction between technical drawing, which you take in a CTE course in middle school, and art typically involves this. Technical drawings are scaled, labeled, and they may or may not be purposeful. Art typically allows a lot more freedom for representation, for communication, or evocation, or provocation. But often artists can't even tell you that much about why they're doing what they're doing. And some of my favorite art teachers are so good at this. I learned so much from them that I now involve them in planning a creative technologies and digital storytelling camp in the summers. Artists also promote vision and intuition and persistence, and those are all really important qualities of being leaders. I think artists also have a jump on others in entrepreneurial thinking. And I think entrepreneurship is something, while it's taught in career and technical education, only a small percentage of students in any school take those entrepreneurship courses, which are typically taught by business teachers, or sometimes marketing teachers, if they're not the same, in some high schools. And it's one of the greatest courses you could teach. I think it's almost as important as for a high school student to take it as a business major in college. I think everybody benefits from understanding entrepreneurship. I think we'd have a lot more independence in our workforce if there was more of a focus on entrepreneurship. Closely tied to entrepreneurship is student autonomy. What can they do without you when you're done with your instruction? And I think that's important for advocacy. And I obviously, in the context of this presentation, I think most of my audience right now is very concerned about their own students' self-advocacy, being able to say, I need this, I want this, I'd like to be in this course, I'd like to have these resources if they're available, that kind of thing. So teaching them advocacy on that personal level transcends to teaching them advocacy on the community level. When they see a community need and can organize, develop, or find those executive function skills to pull together teams of people to accomplish important outcomes. I didn't intend to get into my engineering slides here. I thought I hit all of these, but you're welcome to look at those on your own. And I'm going to wrap up here with just some ideas that help young people get oriented to job hunting and exploration. I think it's wonderful when young people have skills and motivation through art, culture, recreation, and sport. I think many traditional liberal arts majors went on to do amazing things because they had this holistic perspective on the world. Unfortunately, many modern liberal arts programs are only now getting back to that original design when you explored many things. For a long time, liberal arts sometimes meant everything except technical coursework, and they even had math for liberal arts majors and science courses for liberal arts majors. And I think those are fine, by the way, but I hope they're followed up with other math skills and statistics courses and science courses. But the big thing I want people to realize is that if you pursue your interests in the creative side of things or the humanistic side of things and back it up with technical explorations, you'll have much better outcomes. You'll be much more employable. You can find a job while you wait for your dream job to come along, and be surprised at how much you might enjoy something because you're unexpectedly good at it. I make it clear to young people that there are many jobs that might seem like the perfect job for you now, but you may find that after 3, 4, or 14 years, you'll outgrow it. I've been a zookeeper and I've been an aquarium diver, and I loved those jobs. And this probably is one of my dream jobs, raising young endangered animals to adulthood and making them part of a restorative reproductive group. And I got to do that with less exciting experience or organisms than these large mammals. But even I realized that, hey, there are other things out there I want to try and do. I want them to realize that there are strategies by which they can find jobs and apply their sometimes unique skills. And I think some of our twice exceptional students have skills that are not only untapped, but can change the way employers think. And you don't have to wait till you're 18 to get an internship. Not only are internships sometimes available to younger audiences, you can start just by doing your chores and meeting adults' expectations. That can develop into doing similar things for neighbors and relatives and others. And that can be anything from babysitting to mowing lawns and shoveling driveways, etc. To where you get to that first entry level job interview, and you can talk about those things because that's what entry level jobs want to hear, that you've learned how to meet adults expectations. And then you start getting those jobs maybe even as early as 15, but certainly by 16 you can get access to many of those jobs. And in making the case that the biggest way to remain employable between now and when a middle schooler retires, say in 2070, 2072, somewhere around that time, maybe later, because it's assumed that young people today are likely to live beyond 100. That may influence the working age of people. Um, the key is technical skills, communication skills, and a network of people who know about those skills and interests. And I know sliding doors is all about that thing, technical skills and communication skills, and then of course a network that supports that. You may reach out through Krista to connect with me, and especially if you want to do something in the context of sliding doors and what I've presented here today. But if you need to reach out to me in some other way for some other purpose, best is by email. And I sort of have a standing understanding with my graduate students and interns, and yeah, my staff even gets more access. But if you haven't heard back from me in 36 hours, pester me again, and I'll appreciate that. Thank you.